I'd like to introduce our first plenary speaker, Dr. Joseph Allen. He's an associate professor at the Harvard School of Public Health and co-author of Healthy Buildings, How Indoor Spaces Drive Performance and Productivity with John McComber at Harvard Business School. He began his career conducting forensic health investigations of sick buildings in several hundred buildings across a diverse range of industries, including healthcare, education, and commercial offices. At Harvard, Dr. Allen directs the Healthy Buildings program, where he created the 9 foundations of a healthy building. He's also the faculty advisor to the Harvard Healthier Building Materials Academy. He works with Fortune 500 companies on implementing healthy building strategies into their global portfolios. He's also been widely featured in the popular press. I think we've all seen Joe's articles and his presentations, including those in the Wall Street Journal, National Geographic, NPR, and the New York Times, to name just a few. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Dr. Allen has published over 25 op-eds in newspapers where he's translating science into actionable tips for the public, and I think we can all agree that that's hugely important these days. With that, I'd like to welcome Joe Allen to present.
All right, thanks so much. Pleasure to be here.
Oh,
Richard? Yeah.
Yeah, if people have questions through your talk, Joe,
yes.
Go ahead and if you're a participant, put them in there and we'll try to address them towards the end of the talk. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, what a pleasure and privilege to be here. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to share some thoughts today on this Healthy Buildings revolution. And I want to echo that first comment and first thank all of our sponsors for being able to bring us together and put these kind of events together and share that sentiment. It has been such a pleasure to be part of this Healthy Buildings community over the past 2 years and see all of our colleagues all around the world translate the critical science into action. It's really been remarkable. And I know personally, I've had many new collaborations and connections because of this and really got to see our field shine. I think it was ignored early on the pandemic, but thanks to the work of so many, really elevated the importance of indoor air quality, healthy buildings, aerosol science, building science, exposure and risk science, the things we've done well for a long time and was ignored too early in the pandemic. So a big thank you to all of our everyone in this space, in the Healthy Buildings community. It's been it's a privilege to be part of it with you all. So I want to talk today a little bit about this Healthy Buildings revolution. And I thought a lot about this presentation. I actually changed it up recently because there's so many great speakers talking about COVID. We just had Lydia, Lydia's talking about this. And I thought I would talk about this research agenda and go back to something I actually wrote right on the cusp of when the first news of COVID started to come out. And this is an article I wrote with Michael Waring in the Journal of Exposure Science and Environmental Epidemiology, talking about what we saw at the time as the power of healthy buildings research to lift all. And we listed some healthy building research imperatives at the time that I want to talk about and give some examples, touch on my own team's research and others. So 1, buildings as health promoting environments, not just avoiding disease like we've been focused on for the past 2 years. Ventilation standards designed for health. Been talking about this for a long time with a lot of you. Material health, something I think is, or the healthy material revolution, something I don't think is talked about enough, but should be higher up on the crisis list for our space. The move from static to dynamic measurement and correction in buildings as we move from the era of the green building era with the LEED plaque on the wall that represented a time and place, a one moment in time snapshot. We cannot do that with the healthy buildings movement, I think for obvious reasons, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more. Talk about biophilic design, nature and indoor ecology, and last, and most importantly, equity in research. So I'll use this as my outline for the 20 minutes or so here, and really looking forward to your questions and comments, but largely based on our article with Michael. And I'll bring in some of the new research, as I promised in the abstract. I said we'll talk about some of my own team's research, particularly our newer cognitive function research. So let's start with number 1. Buildings as health promoting environments. We've been very much focused on the half of health, disease avoidance, and we know health is not just absence of disease, it's flourishing, it's well-being, it's cognitive performance, it's all these beneficial aspects. And I think we've lost sight of that a little bit, not because we had to, but there's an opportunity right now to capture on this paradigm shift everyone's talking about. As I've been talking about it, thinking about it for a few years with my team at Harvard, we put out this 9 Foundations of a Healthy Building, mostly as a way to communicate all of your great research to the business community. In fact, right now I'm at Harvard Business School. That's where it's behind me. I'm teaching a class over here. And the conversations are really different at the business school. I encourage everyone to go do it. In fact, I'll share a little story just from this morning. I started talking about climate impacts, co-benefits analysis, and I kind of blew through PM 2.5, right? You're in our field, you're tired of talking about this topic, but I was asked to stop and explain it. So think about that. The things we take for granted as common knowledge is actually not always common knowledge. And so I took time to explain what is this that we talk about in our field so much, but maybe to a business audience is quite new and quite different. That was the motivation for this 9 Foundations of a Healthy Building, was to kind of try and simplify all this 40 years, 50 years of great science into something that the business community could latch onto and say, okay, we get these domains and we can optimize each of these. Along those lines, I want to talk about the half of health and our work on cognitive function. We're now in our 3rd iteration, what we call our Cog Effects study. And this last one was a global study of over 300 people, over 40 buildings. We followed people, workers, office workers at their desks for an entire year. And for each worker, we deployed an air quality sensor at their desk, measuring the usual suspects in terms of real-time indicators of indoor air quality. We built our research app, which allows us to administer the entire study. Really quite interesting for researchers out there to think about doing everything from informed consent, basic line questionnaires, integrating sensor data into an app, and administering cognitive tests. Everyone got a Fitbit so we could track physical activity and sleep, and a bracelet down there I'll explain in a minute for passive air quality sampling. One of the things I want to talk about in terms of findings from that study that I think will interest this group is our 2 key takeaways that I thought were important. One is we were able to look at the influence of CO2 as a proxy for ventilation and the impact on a cognitive function test, this Stroop test. Again, repeat measures, testing people at their desk, co-located in time and space, and multiple measurements of this. Now, what I think is interesting on this graph is the area in between the interquartile range here. And if you look at the levels, the CO2 on the x-axis there, we had a lot of data. Look at the narrow confidence interval band under 1,000 parts per million, right? The classic threshold here. And what we see is that for each improvement in ventilation with CO2 as the indicator, the scores improved, or said the other way, as ventilation or CO2 got higher, we saw scores drop. And it was continuous. That is what I think was most interesting in this study, that there didn't seem to be, we've heard pushback, well, there's some threshold, maybe there's some compensatory response. We didn't see it. We actually saw a linear range, which to me, I think big picture takeaway, talking about the business community or messaging impact, is that even good buildings, or buildings we thought were good buildings, have room to improve. And in fact, there may not be a threshold, and it's something our field, I think, needs to explore a little bit more. Another key finding from this study that I'm not going to share a slide on, but it's in a published paper if you're interested, was that we also saw an acute effect of PM 2.5 on cognitive performance, indoor PM 2.5. Think about how we do all of our studies at PM 2.5, epidemiological studies. We take a sensor from a central location, make some estimate about the exposure that's happening, ignore what's happening in the building or how the building is mitigating or influencing that response. And in this case, again, we saw this acute effect. So an immediate effect on the cognitive test scores in relation to indoor PM 2.5 levels. So I think that's a new area, and thanks to the ubiquity of these low-cost sensors that perform, I'll call them reasonably well for our needs for this kind of study, we're able to do these long-term assessments and actually see these real-time effects indoors. So a finding we're pretty excited about in this Cog Effects series. We have, I think, 3 papers in that from this study and a couple more coming right behind it, and a new study we just launched on homes that follows the same methodology. And a plug to our new doctoral student, Sandra Tedesco. Many of you know her. She presented already, is working on what will be the 5th generation of the Cog Effects study. So a lot more coming soon as we work with you all to try to advance this methodology and our understanding of how indoor air is influencing cognitive function as a proxy here for productivity and performance. Okay. So I want to cover a lot more across all of those 6 themes I opened with. So I also want to talk about ventilation standards designed for health. It's been no secret. I've been highly critical of ASHRAE over the past couple of years, and I think it's hard to look inward at ourselves sometimes. But I think it's a moment for reflection, and I think it's happening in that these standards are just not designed for health. I don't think this is a secret anymore. Here's a modeling we did with the New York Times on respiratory aerosols and how they spread in a classroom to kind of make the invisible visible here. And in this article, we talk about the benefits of ventilation and filtration, of course. But fundamentally, the problem is that the standards are not set for health in the first place. Could you imagine we entered this pandemic with a ventilation standard that was applied to buildings, schools, offices, homes, everywhere, that was designed for health or even designed to up and protect against infectious diseases? Imagine how the response and the impact, how different it would have been over the past 2 years, let alone the fight to even have people recognize that ventilation is important. And then once it was recognized, have people implement this. That just didn't happen. And had we done it, had we been doing it right for the past 40 years, we would have found ourselves in a lot different place. So I think our field needs to look inward here pretty hard and do a deep dive and say, what are we actually trying to do? We have a power. The world is listening, maybe for the first time, the whole world is listening to this conversation on healthy buildings. And so it's a real moment for us and we can't blow it. All right, so I don't think anybody, oh, well, in this group, yeah, so we've mapped out, I mean, others have done this many times, mapped out the 100-year history of the ventilation rates, and below what I would say the scientific evidence is quite clear is too low right now for health. And let's call it even forgetting the infectious disease side of this, even just optimal performance. What is a healthy indoor environment? I think it's hard for anyone at our field, I would think, to say that the current standards are healthy standards. They're really not health-based. Any remote imagination or imaginative thinking about it. All right, I'm not going to stay on this because everyone's talking about the paradigm shift. I think that's great. We had Lydia come talk already, but I do think this is the moment. And if we're not going to do it, someone else is going to do it. And if our field's not going to put forth these healthy building and ventilation standards for health, others will try to define it for us. And I think there's a real danger here. I talk about it in my book about comparing it to Elizabeth Holmes. If you're not familiar, the Theranos investor was just found guilty. But the reason I tie it to healthy buildings, this conversation is, if you made a mistake on green buildings years ago, worst thing, it's bad, but nobody dies in that building. You cut a corner, or you do a ventilation standard you kind of think is evidence-based or not, or you health wash something, and somebody gets sick in that building, that's a real problem. For the person's health, number one, first and foremost, also brand, liability, risk, all those things factor into place. We have to be really careful that others don't come in and health wash, and you're seeing all sorts of products come on the market right now that are actually some are health washing. We have to be careful here as an industry and actually lift our collective voices to say, no, this is what the science says in terms of what a evidence-based standard is for ventilation and health. In terms of third on the list is material health, a topic I've been talking about since my doctoral work on flame retardant chemicals, and my team at Harvard continues this work. And in fact, I'm not going to spend all that much time on it because we have a great colleague of mine on my team who's going to be presenting on this. But I'll talk about this issue of chemical whack-a-mole that I wrote about in the Washington Post years ago, actually. And here's the opening of that article. When new parents see the words BPA-free on a baby bottle or sippy cup, they're meant to assume the product is safe. This may well not be the case, quite to the contrary. In fact, in some cases, hormone-disrupting BPA, bisphenol A, has simply been swapped for similar chemical BPS, bisphenol S, that may well pose even greater dangers to child health. In this way, manufacturers have done an end around on the much publicized dangers of BPA without addressing the underlying problem. Even more disturbing, what's happened with baby products and BPA is the tip of the iceberg. Points to a phenomenon known in the world of public health as regrettable substitution, cynical replacement of one harmful chemical by another equally or more harmful in a never-ending game being played with our health. I actually hate the term regrettable substitution. It sounds like an innocuous or innocent mistake. The reality is we know better and we should be doing better, but the market is doing a poor job of policing itself. No more so than on the issue of forever chemicals or the PFAS chemicals. I wrote an article branding them forever chemicals, a play on the carbon-fluorine bond here, the fact that they actually never fully degrade in the environment and are associated with a whole host of health effects, everything from kidney cancer to testicular cancer, impacts on lipid metabolism. But this is an area where it's not just one-on-one regrettable substitution. At this point, we have thousands, over 5,000 by last count, maybe 6,000 different forever chemicals. How are we going to even decide what to study next in terms of its health effects? It's impossible for our field to keep up. We need to start treating these as a class and do a much better job before we put these chemicals into products that go in our buildings. They are the next legacy pollutants, the next asbestos, PCBs. It's hard to not see how these are going to be chemicals that are we're going to have to be dealing with in the future because we put so much of them in our products in our buildings. If you want to know more about this and the latest, and I think the greatest, some of the best work happening on healthy materials, you absolutely have to see a couple talks by Dr. Anna Young on our team. She's a postdoctoral fellow. I had the pleasure of being her doctoral mentor and now postdoctoral mentor, but she's been talking about not just what we do about these chemicals or measuring them with these silicone wristbands, but also when we intervene, when we design building level control strategies, what happens? Well, I guess you should see her talk to see what happens. But I think the key takeaway is when we act, we see a difference. And you'll see some really remarkable work on even looking at the hormone potential of dust. So absolutely go find Dr. Young's talks, and I promise you'll be blown away, in particular on the hormonal activity of dust. It's really cutting edge work. Okay, in terms of our role here and this idea of how do we drive research into real practice that leads to the betterment of the world? Well, we're changing how we do things right here at Harvard. We have a partnership with Google. We have this Healthier Building Materials Academy. We are following the precautionary principle, less toxic, not non-toxic. We are thinking about regrettable substitutions and swapping out of one harmful chemical for another, being careful there. Innocent until proven guilty is great for criminal justice. It's terrible for chemical policy. And we have shown, we have over 40 projects on our campus, including our brand new flagship science and engineering complex. We can design these buildings with healthier products, no impact to cost, performance of the product, or it does not impact the timeline of construction and renovation. That's key, because if you're going to implement these strategies, you have to show that the business case does not get harmed, and it can be done. Many examples out there. So our field needs to keep hammering on studying these chemicals, talking about these exposure pathways, and linking it back to products so that we can do better and help move the market, and thinking about these classes of chemicals. Okay. Next up on the list, changing from static to dynamic evaluation and the proliferation of environmental sensors. Here's an article I wrote with my colleague and co-author of Healthy Buildings, John McCumber at Harvard Business School. He's right next door, teaching the class. And was this key point, I think, early on in the pandemic, June 2020. Who guarantees your workplace is safe for return? Think about that moment in the COVID-19 pandemic. Early spring 2020, every company had their SOP, their plan in place, right? Some were good, some were bad, but everyone had a plan in place. Should have had a plan in place at that point. Some did. But the key question was not just the plan, but who guarantees it's safe to go back to school or the workplace? And how would we know that? And we were calling for, and many of you are on this page too, the real-time monitoring and verification that the plans put in place are actually working. And here, I don't think this is a surprise, use of low-cost sensors measure things like carbon dioxide. Here's actually data from Harvard Business School from right at that time point, measuring classroom air exchange rates through decay curves and automatic analysis of the automated analysis of the decay curves to estimate real-time air exchange rates, outdoor air exchange rates. Before improvements were made, I should point that out. So I see this sensor movement going to talk about our field is there's a great convergence happening. I think there are too many silos. There still are. But if you look around and talk, if you go to a buildings conference, not a healthy buildings conference, a general buildings conference, non-science conference, you'll see people say, I'm in the green building space. I'm in the safe building space. I'm in the smart building space. I think it's all part of the same movement. It's the healthy buildings movement, honestly, because it's all related. What we're talking about here is human health and performance. And the reason we care about smart buildings, safe buildings, and green buildings, honestly, is all about human health, both inside the four walls of the building and beyond the four walls. Thinking about nature, I thought it would pay tribute to a colleague here at Harvard, E.O. Wilson, who authored the book, Biophilia in 1984, and really put this idea of indoor ecology or indoor nature on the map, and he just passed away just a few weeks ago, really put the field of biophilic design on the map. we walled ourselves off from nature for so long, and we've seen the effects, right, in buildings. And the idea is, well, how do we reconnect? And one of the things my team's been working on with Dr. Jay Yin, who's now a professor in China, was how do you start to quantify the impacts of biophilic design? It's been a great field. I think it's been long on theory, short on quantification. And I'll share just some of the few results from our most recent research where we actually use virtual reality to simulate different environments, put people in different environments with different levels of design attributes. And so why VR? One, if anybody's not used VR, you should really find yourself a headset. You will see that it elicits a real response. If you're in a roller coaster, if you're stand outside a building, you can fly in an airplane, you can be in a horror movie, it makes people sweat, it makes them nervous. You see a visceral response. So we had this idea a couple of years ago, could we use VR for biophilic design studies? And the first thing we did is we tested it out, real spaces versus VR, and showed what we expected, that VR can elicit this response. Then it becomes a powerful tool because you can take this ugly office in the top left and start to change one or two things here, start eye tracking, see what people are looking at, and use this really cool tool to assess whether or not biophilic design, we can quantify these impacts. And the answer is yes, we can. And one of the most interesting findings from our recent work was this restoration study on the left, figure on the left. We stimulate people, you stress them. And it turns out that, and then we put them in one of these different environments, bland office, something with trees, some with a window. And it turns out in the rooms that were designed in a biophilic environment that people recovered more quickly and more fully after a simple stressor. And look at the time course down there, on the time course of minutes. We could actually quantify this and see it. We also saw impacts on better reaction time and better creativity scores, again, on these cognitive function tests, showing that, yeah, we could actually elicit these kind of responses. And the tool becomes powerful as a research tool because we can start to parse out, well, what is it? Is it plants? Is it biomorphic shapes and patterns? Is it blueness, greenness? What is it? And two, in terms of application, think about all the people that can't get and access nature who could use this as a recovery tool. If you are in the hospital, if you're in an urban setting, you can't get out to national parks. Can we use this tool as a way to actually bring nature back to people, bring back indoors, and design better spaces with some of these attributes? Okay, last and most important, equity in research. I think our field needs to do a much better job here on the inclusion side. And I'll show one graph here from colleagues just a couple of years ago. I've been talking about this since day one of the pandemic in particular, talking about how the risks are not evenly distributed. Not only do we have a design standard that is not designed for health, but it's not a performance-based standard. And the risks are different. We see, and this is school classroom data as an example, in schools with a majority predominant Black or Hispanic population, lower ventilation rates than in populations that are white. We also see these impacts or these differences in equities based on socioeconomics. In this case, the figure on the right showing lower ventilation rates in schools that had a predominant or majority of student body on free or reduced lunch as an indicator of economics of the kids in that community, in that school. So this is well known. Maybe not so much outside our field. There's a handful of studies like this that start to look at these exposure disparities, and then they're important because then they become motivators for action and change. Because I don't think there were many people before COVID-19 that, one, recognized ventilation was important, two, that the ventilation was not designed for health, and three, that these wide disparities and inequities exist across the board. We've seen it in schools, we see it in offices, we see it in industry across the board. So we actually need more of these kind of studies to raise awareness about what is actually happening to motivate that change. And this is how Michael and I summed it up in our article here, is that if we think about this burgeoning healthy buildings movement, it will be an absolute failure if it's confined to the brand new shiny building in Midtown Manhattan, New York City, or only those that can afford it, or if it becomes a luxury. A healthy building is a luxury. A healthy home is a luxury item. It cannot be. It has to be a movement for all. To do that, we think there's a couple of things we recommend that our field focus on in terms of research agenda. One, a diverse set of buildings. right? Think about the number of buildings we've studied in the past. It wasn't uncommon to do a set of studies on a handful of buildings for a day, 2 days, a week. We now have the ability to study buildings all over the world, all different typologies, and study them for a longer period of time than we've been doing. It doesn't have to be a week anymore. We can have these long-term longitudinal studies. 2, we absolutely need to increase the number and representation of races and ethnicities that have been historically underrepresented in research, and not just in research in our field. Look across the studies of the past several decades, and you will see this across all the studies. It's time for our field to do a much better job here on including different races and ethnicities and evaluating the differential impacts. 3, another area critically important to me is we have not focused on the unique needs, physiology, and preferences of women. Same thing when you look across the board and how our standards have been set for a long time. Some of our recent research, we'll have to share at the next meeting that should be published kind of soon, starting to show these differing impacts, not just on preference, but also on physiological indicators that we see by gender differences. And last here in our list is exploring the entirety of the life course, from reproduction, preconception exposures that influence the child, and all the way through advanced aging. This is an area that, as we talk about in public health, the areas that are going to need a lot of focus going forward in particular is advanced aging. We talk about climate, we talk about a lot of the issues are a lot of focus now on infectious disease, but also one that keeps popping up in every conversation across all disciplines in public health is advanced aging. I think our field can play a major role going forward. So last thing I'll say before I head to Q&A is one last thought here, and trying to motivate our field into where the field of epidemiology has had a lot of success and our field has not. If you think about what we know about human health and healthy living and how we know about it, we know exercise is good for us. We know what a good meal looks like. We know that outdoor air pollution is bad for us. We know smoking is bad for us. But if you look at how we know this, it is all from these great human epidemiological cohort studies that follow tens of thousands of people, not 10, not 100, tens of thousands over decades and years. They have shaped our fundamental understanding of what it means to lead a healthy life. If you look at all of those studies, the great human epidemiological cohort studies, Framingham Heart Study, Nurses Health Study, 6 cities air pollution study, none of them talk about the role of the building. Our field is missing out on the possibility and potential of influencing and shaping what it means to lead a healthy lifestyle because we have not put together similar cohorts that really start to address how the building starts to shape human health. So last thought here from a friend. Oh, sorry for the book plug. I meant to pull that out. A friend of mine, Lord Norman Foster, had invited me out to his offices, Foster and Partners, out in the UK prior to COVID. And after we spoke for a long time about healthy buildings, here's someone who's been talking about breathable buildings since the 60s. And this is what he said to me over dinner. We need a new generation of humanitarian design ideas underpinned by scientific research. So I love that last line in particular, underpinned by scientific research. That's what you're all doing. That's what our field is doing. And that's where we can influence this next generation of humanitarian design. So thanks for the invitation to present today. I'm looking forward to any comments or questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That was fabulous. You covered a lot of ground, but I think the call to action is, well, like you said, the revolution has started. Let's hope we can follow through with the revolution. So I'd like to actually start with a question about that. So one of the questions from Claire Barnett is, it may be a revolution and I want it to be, but if so, why have the White House and Congress declined to fund US EPA on indoor air quality, the only agency with such an authorization in an airborne pandemic?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think I'd look across the board. I don't think it's just that one agency. I think the federal government, U.S. response has been abysmal, both for the Trump administration. I don't think the Biden administration has done much better despite all of our hopes. In terms of the recognition around ventilation, I don't think we've stood up. I don't think we've utilized the full potential of OSHA, EPA. I don't think we've leveraged enough of these academic public partnerships. I don't think we've leveraged public-private partnerships and leveraged the business community. So I think it's been a failure all along. I appreciate the comments about EPA in particular, but if you look more with a wider lens, it has been a failure straight through. There have been bills proposed to for business benefits and tax incentives to improve ventilation that did not get passed. Our legislators have failed, this U.S. context here. So I just think it's really more broad. And I think it speaks to the moment. I think it has the failure of an entire response to grapple just how important buildings were to our largely failed response.
And I like the largely failed response, which is the quote of the day. I have another question here from the audience. Who will fund the needed research on buildings and epi studies? Do you have some suggestions there? And, you know, especially you're talking about, for instance, like schools and other places, you know, that are chronically underfunded as well.
Yeah, I think this is something our field can do a lot better. And to be honest, I'm not the best at this. I think there are a lot more people that have a lot more success with federal funding. I do a lot through foundations and even philanthropists. But when I see my colleagues in public health who are really successful at this, they're putting in multi-institutional kind of leverage and pressure on NIH and others to say, we need to fund these kind of infrastructure pieces, right? Think of the Nurses Health Studies, now in Nurses Health 3. Well, they're able to do all sorts of creative things. People can do sub-studies on them, looking at metals or whatever toxic you want. And we just don't have that. So one is we can embed our stuff in these existing cohorts and say, you know what, let's throw a healthy building science overlay.
Over it, yes.
Or and they have all the health outcome data. Or we start building our own. But I think the new tools allow us to get a lot more creative. We can say, hey, let's throw these sensors out. We can study people for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. Like that's really different, I think, for our field, but it speaks to that new potential.
Okay, excellent. And I think, Richard, we have several comments here. Actually, you have quite a few questions, but we're going to run out of time. But Richard, did you have a question?
I've got a quick question, Joe. Good talk. You talked about sensors, and I'm dealing with these same issues as well. More and more sensors are on the market. They're becoming common, almost being marketed to households and businesses and commercial enterprises. And so it's more like indoor measurements for the masses. And I'm talking about VOCs, PM, CO2, et cetera, et cetera. Are we ready for that? How do we interpret? And do we know enough to be able to define what is that red, yellow, green?
Yeah, what a question. Great question. I agree. And right, every platform that's out there now, consumer grade versus more towards the research grade, right? Everyone's got a color coding system. And yeah, we've tried to decode some of these. And I think that's honestly, one of the big opportunities for our field is help to define what that is, right? What's a red CO2 level? It depends what your objective is, I would think. Same thing with TVOC. I mean, how do you TVOC? One of the trickiest things I think, to make meaning of or make sense. So I think it's about, what are we trying to measure and why? What's the right tool? What level of precision do we need and accuracy and all that? And then this interpretation, the way I talk about it with my students is we have multiple levels, right? You have these occupational limits, you have risk-based limits, you have these optimization targets. And I think it's going to depend for each person based on the goal. But, like it or not, our field has to be ready for this. And I'm an industrial hygienist. That's traditional, right? You go out, take an air sample, send it to a lab, you analyze the data. Well, the field right now has to be able to, we're a data science field. Right. And so how are we going to handle all these data streams, make sense of them, and not just the CO2 data stream coming in, but CO2 in relation to PM, in relation to light, noise, all the other factors, and whatever, future sensors we get in the next year or 2 and 5 and 10 years. Yeah. That's going to be our field. That will define our field for the next 10 or 20 years. We'll be a data science field.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Well, we have many questions, but we're going to capture these questions and save them, and then we can pass them along to you. We now need to turn it over to our next speaker. I believe John's going to do a brief introduction for our next, the sponsor for the next session. And then Richard, you'll do Terry's introduction.
Yes, thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Dr. Allen. That was a great presentation, as will be our next one. Which will be given by Terry Brennan, who Richard will introduce. I just want to mention, if we could put up the slide for the next presentation, that our recognized sponsor for this presentation, also a platinum sponsor, is Train Technologies. And the name of this presentation from Terry is IEQ, Research, Practice, and Two-Way Bridges. There we go. There's our slide. There's good-looking Mr. Brennan. And Richard, if it's okay, I'm going to pass it off to you to do the introduction. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. Terry Brennan, there's so much to be said here. I'm going to take a small excerpt. Building scientist, educator, and a building nerd, if you will. But I mean that in the best of ways. He's studied building since the 70s. Because of his background in physics, biology, and building construction, Terry combines theory and practice in a unique and integrated way. He's president and senior building scientist at Cameron Associates from its founding in 1984. And he's the primary author of the US EPA Moisture Control for Commercial Building Design and Construction, Operation, and Maintenance. He's a contributing author to ASHRAE Indoor Air Quality Guide, the ASHRAE Residential Indoor Air Quality Guide, and the US EPA Building Air Quality, a guide for owners and managers. Member of 62.2, member of ASTM, and many other associations. Terry, he served as a consultant to the National Academy of Science on dampness and health, and presented testimony to the committee indoor air quality and the IOM committee on IAQ and climate change. I've known Terry for almost 30 to 33 years. Personally, he's been an inspiration, and when I first met him, he set me along my path. I can't say more about him. He's one of the closest friends I've had, but really, truly an inspiration. And the only one I've ever met like him is Phil Morey, and both outstanding individuals. But with that, Terry, you take it away.
My shares, oh, there we go. Share. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay, so I just need to.
Yeah.
No, I can't do that. I have to do this. Sorry, I have too many screens working here. Let's see.
I think you just need to play your slideshow now, Terry.
Yeah, I did. I did that, and it's on a different screen. I thought we had this working yesterday. Hang on a second. I will. Going to try something different. Oh, I want to share a different screen.
It's looking promising. So if you
Uh,
could just hit the full screen to your left of your down toggle there. I'm sorry, at the very bottom. Excellent.
the problem I'm having is that when I go to show, it doesn't come up on this screen. It's coming up on a different screen.
That's okay. You could probably just scroll through this if you don't mind in
I
this
don't
mode.
mind.
Yeah,
We can see it.
we
So can
fine.
you just do down arrow and see if you can advance your slides?
You betcha. I can do that.
And
It'll
we will
advance.
be here.
All right.
And
Yeah,
your hair
well,
was shorter there before. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, I have my COVID cut now. So uh, I'm Terry Brennan. I'm actually mostly retired now, and Cam Roden is dissolved. And the face that you see me making there is my what the heck is going on here face. My puzzled face, because either I found a mystery in a building, or I can't believe people have done what they've done in their building. So I I wear that face a lot, and I love the mystery aspect of it. But being a physics major, learning to communicate with people effectively didn't really come naturally to me. I was very annoyed when I figured out that reports didn't fix buildings, and I had to actually work with the people in the buildings to get things fixed. So I'd like to extend my thanks to Iziak and to Siri for hosting this and for putting this conference together. I would like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to give a plenary, and I'm still not sure what the heck they were thinking when they did that. And I'd like to thank the sponsors, because without them, it would certainly be a different conference. And I also at this time would like to thank all the people, organizations, agencies, and buildings who wittingly or unwittingly taught me lessons I won't soon forget. Although at my age, I may already have forgotten. As I thought about the title of my talk, research and practice and bridges between them, and those bridges, it was clear to me, are information and results flow in both directions. I, I, it eventually dawned on me that it's a whole lot more like a map of the internet. This image is a map of the internet that includes, it's about not the entire internet. This is something like 20% of the activity on one day in 2005. And I think that the indoor environmental community is more like this, that we're connected in many, many, many ways with many, many bridges, more like a neural network than like a bridge. And that information bounces around in there just like it does on the internet. And I think of places that look like this, which actually this is probably the UK, might be the UK. I look at places like that and like this where I see a nexus, and I think about places that where there's a concentration of activity and research, and the information spreads out from there out to all the practitioners. And by practitioners, I'm thinking about that not only the restoration community, but also I'm thinking about medical practices, and I'm thinking about industrial hygiene practices, and I'm thinking about building science practices, because we all end up in the buildings and trying to solve problems there. And some of these places, like in my own experience, University of Texas in Austin is like a hot spot for the information that I've found useful over the years, and the research that seems to me most applicable for the things that I do. Other hotspots might be journals like Indoor Air or Environmental Health Perspectives, or other research centers like Lawrence Berkeley National Labs that is extremely prolific at putting out research that's, I find, very useful and making it accessible to me. And in a lot of ways, my career has been telling the stories that emerge from the research community to the community of practitioners. It also has been telling the stories of the practitioners and what they've observed and what they've experimented with and what things they've found that are important back to the research community. And so that's essentially the heart of my talk today. I'm going to start with a perspective of my own, which is my definition of a building is a way of transporting a dry Mediterranean climate to every godforsaken place on the planet. And we do that by enclosing an indoor space and water sealing it and air sealing it and insulating it well enough so that with reasonable amounts of fuel, we can keep it warm or cool and ventilated and filtered and have the air filtered. Those are the things that we want the enclosure to do for us. And it has, the enclosure is, because most climates are not a dry Mediterranean climate. A whole lot of the year, the enclosure is an environmental transition zone. And if you are not careful about how you layer up your enclosure systems, you'll grow interesting living organisms, you'll be colonized by pest species, you'll have advanced radical corrosion of metals. All kinds of building related problems can occur. So that's a crucial way for me to think about both existing buildings, where have those systems failed for us, and in the design of new buildings to try and design buildings that are resistant to those problems. Here are a few of my lessons over the years. Reports don't solve or prevent problems in buildings. People actually do that. Oftentimes when I go to a commercial or a public building, an institutional building that has a problem, the first people I talk to are the buildings and grounds folks, the facilities managers, because about half the time they know what's wrong and they know how to fix it. And the problem is someone in the institution is blocking them, is stopping them from actually getting the resources they need to make the fix. And so my job is to figure out not what's wrong with the building. I have to confirm that their idea of what's wrong with the building is correct. But I need to figure out who the heck is blocking them and what they need to feel comfortable enough to sign off on, yeah, we should go ahead with this fix. So I think that the social sciences are an important science in building science. And we should learn more about understanding people. If you want to change things at a community level, one of the things I've learned in community-based projects is that generally the way those projects are set up, is that most of the budget goes to consultants and consulting firms, and we ask the community people to volunteer their time. This really doesn't work very well in my experience. If you want a community to sustain program after you've left, then you need fewer consultants and a lot more community people who are being paid or invested in so that they can establish an ongoing entrepreneurial program so that it becomes self-sustaining. This is an old slide for me. This is a slide from when I worked on the Oklahoma Lung Association Health House program. And I said it's more or less 6 steps to healthier buildings. And the first one is to understand and educate people, which I just spoke about at some length. Education is truly critical for us. One of the things I've learned working with like really big construction companies that build Air Force buildings and buildings at Harvard, at the Harvard School of the Harvard Business School. Joe, we did some work up there on that one when that was under construction. Is that I can get a team from a big construction organization or architectural design firm working as a team that gets good building enclosures, good mechanical systems, good filtration, good materials. And then a year later, I get designs from the same group that are horrible. It's like nothing got learned. And we have to teach this stuff over and over again every year to everyone entering the field because it's a huge turnover. People move on from where they are and the lessons get lost. So education, it's not a one-time deal, it's an ongoing effort. The second step is keep the building dry, clean, and pest-free. And those are all contaminant source related variables. But I realized at the time that I made this slide that if buildings were kept dry, clean, and pest-free, about 85% of my caseload would disappear. And so I thought it was worthwhile to call those 3 items out specifically and devote some time to it. The dry is pretty well documented. There are lots of great information sources for how to keep buildings from avoiding, for how to have buildings avoid moisture problems. Oops. The next 2 are about ventilation, and the first one is if you have an unavoidable source of air contaminant, or you can exhaust vent as near to the source as possible, and it's far more energy efficient to do that and effective to do that than it is to try and get the same reduction by introducing dilution air that you mix up. So exhaust vent the unavoidable stationary sources and provide dilution ventilation and filter that outdoor air ventilation for the unavoidable mobile or large source area sources of contaminant. And the last one is reduce unplanned airflows in buildings. And I'll talk about that a little more in a few minutes. About 30% of my caseload over the years, at the heart of it, was an airflow through a building that no one planned. And a simple example would be a 3-story apartment building in Syracuse, New York, where they had carbon monoxide monitors going off on the top floor. There was a tuck under garage for half of the basement level. We released tracer gas in the garage, and 32 seconds later, it appeared on the top floor, bypassing the floors in between. So we had an unplanned airflow, which means we had a pressure difference, and we had a pretty wide open pathway from the garage up into the plumbing walls of the top floor. And I'll guarantee you, no engineer put a little arrow showing that airflow on the drawing. So the people again, start where the client's at. This is a quote from Florence Hollis from her classic book on social casework. For a couple of years, I ran a group home for emotionally disturbed adolescent boys, which put me in good stead for working in the building community. The second quote is I've seen attributed to Carl Jung. Intellect is a fly speck on the sea of emotion. We tend to make our decisions in emotional ways, and we lay a veneer of logic on top of them so that they make sense to us. I'm okay with that at this time in my life. Here's an example. This is my sister-in-law. She's allergic to cats. She has cats. That's how we are. That kind of thing used to make me crazy, but it doesn't anymore. I kind of love the fact that we seem to be bitten by the imp of the perverse when we're born, and and we get better at it as we get older. So buildings are environmental barriers that surround us in essentially hostile climates a lot of the time. And the weather is the driving force, and that's a chaotic system. And it's occupied by creatures and operated by creatures who are completely insane. Those of you who are mechanical engineers or HVAC contractors will recognize that this picture is in a part of a commercial building where people aren't getting the air conditioning they want in the summertime. And so they permanently installed a swag light so that they could swing the light over against the thermostat, turn the light on, heat the thermostat up, and get more air conditioning. This is a good example of Brennan's law of occupant behavior number 2, which is that there's no intervention or prevention I can make that's so well thought through or so thoroughly enabled that it can't be completely undone by a determined or simply unlucky occupant. This is this is an example of what I call post-construction engineering. These folks put a storm door on their entryway door and didn't realize until they tried to open it that the door would hit the carrying beam for the roof of the porch, at which point someone said, "Joey, get a chisel." So I find these kinds of, I have a whole talk I can give about these kinds of post-construction or engineering things. Occupancies in different buildings lead to different indoor environments and different contaminant sources and different exposure mechanisms. Kids are pretty amazing at the things that they can do, and so are the grown-ups. I've actually given up ever trying to collect any data by leaving data loggers in science classrooms because the science teachers can't keep their hands off my equipment. I want to mention, this is the keep buildings clean thing. I want to mention that the people who keep buildings clean almost never have enough custodial closets, and these are the things that I like to see in a custodial closet. I'd like one for every 14 to 18,000 square feet. I'd like the custodial closet to be within 150 feet of the all work area for the custodian. No, custodian should not have to carry equipment up and down stairs. I want hot water. I want a floor mop sink. I want things so it can be hosed down. I want exhaust ventilation because you sometimes generate crap in there. And it needs to be big enough for the custodial supplies to be stored, but too small for someone to try and take it over and store stuff that doesn't belong in the custodial closet. On the pest control side of things, if you build it, they will come. And there are not actually very many centralized resources where you can read about architectural interventions to make it an uncomfortable place for pests to be. But the ASHRAE Indoor Air Quality Guide, Best Practices for Design, Construction, and Commissioning, and the residential equivalent of that both have pretty good guidance on making buildings pest resistant. And now I'm going to illustrate, thinking back to my 3D image of the internet and the neural network. I'm going to illustrate some case studies of oh, I'm almost done with my time, aren't I?
Terry,
Yeah.
Terry, I just wanted to make a note for attendees. The speaker ready room for this stage is being pushed back to approximately 4:20 p.m. Because, yeah, we're trying to put it all in. But you've got another 10 minutes, Terry. So
Okay, that's good.
absolutely. Go for it.
So I have a few case studies that illustrate that kind of zoom in on specific bridging between the research community and the practice community. And my first one is a case where I had seen Charlie Weschler talk about ozone reactions many years ago when I first met Charlie. And then years later, I had this case, 6 offices in a mid-rise office building in Manhattan. And a good friend of mine who's a very good industrial hygienist had been hired to try and figure out the odor problems they were having in there. The odors were described as sort of skunky or musky, or sometimes like you lit a kitchen match. So I'm thinking probably thiol or a furan or something like that. But she collected a bunch of summa canisters and sorbent tubes. The odor was there that day, according to the people who were complaining about the odors, who had noticed the odors, reported them, and they and nothing turned up in the results that looked like it could be responsible for the kind of odors they were having. So they gave me a call, and I went down there, and the first thing I did was meet with the facility manager and learned that they have supply and return in each of the rooms in all the offices, and that they have airside economizer. And on the day I was there, the airside economizer was in operation. And we went and looked at the air handler for the office we were going to go and inspect. we went to the office, and the office was still furnished, but the person who occupied it had moved to another office, which actually is probably 60% of the time, that's the solution for this kind of a problem in an office building. That they just move the person who's having a problem in that office out of it and move in an insensitive guy. And so the office was empty, and the person who occupied that office, who's reported the odor, said the odor is very strong here today, and the facilities manager said it was very strong, but I couldn't smell it at all. So they become my sensors, and what I did is I had them sniff the supply air, and they reported that the supply air didn't have the odor in it. And I know that there was a lot of outdoor air in it, so it's probably not coming in from outside, and it's probably not being transported by the air handling system. So I masked off the return grill, and we went out and closed the door and took a break for 15 or 20 minutes, and then came back. And when I closed the door first and checked with a smoke bottle all around at the floor wall connection and electrical outlets in the walls, and I used a manometer and measured under the door, and the room was pressurized by about 10, 15 pascals. And so I knew that there was no air being sucked into the room from other parts of the building then. So we went out, we came back, and it still smelled. So I knew the source was in the room. So we took all the furnishings out of the room. And we did the same little test. Still smells. Got some poly, covered the carpet. Room still smells. Started covering the walls with the poly, and when the walls were about half covered, they said, "Hey, the odor's gone." So I said, "Well, look, I think what's going on here is the paint or the gypsum board is reacting with something in the outdoor air." And having heard Charlie talk, I thought probably this is low-level ozone reaction, and I think we can fix this by repainting the wall. It's probably something in the paint, and if we put a barrier between it and what I suspect is low level of ozone in the outdoor air, I think the odor will go away. So they said sure, and we found some nice high quality 100% acrylic low VOC paints, and they picked out colors and they painted it, and the odor went away. And then the facilities guy called and said, "Hey, you know what? Those 6 rooms that where we had this problem, they had all been repainted about a month before we started having the complaints." So we didn't figure out what the contaminant was. Later on, Joe Stieberich figured it out. Well, actually, a research lab associate that Joe put on the case figured it out when he had some similar problems, and it turned out to be back when they took mercury out of the paint, and they were experimenting with antifungals, and one of the antifungals would react with the ozone, and that's what would cause that odor problem. So that's I'd like you to notice that that problem got solved without making any contaminant measurements. That was just listening to people and using logic to screen down to what the dynamics were. Plus, if I had never heard Charlie speak about ozone, I'd still be scratching my head about it. So the next case that I want to talk about is in 1993, Building Science Corporation was approached by a large home builder in Chicago, which is 6,500 heating degree day Fahrenheit days, and probably not 1,190 heating degrees C. So don't pay any attention to that. The original problem, which got them a foot in the door, is the fireplaces spill smoke in cold weather. And we've been building these houses with these fireplaces for 10 years, and we haven't had this problem before, and nothing's changed. But what had changed is they switched to continuous soffit and ridge vents instead of a couple of little mushroom vents on the attic roof. And that pushed, in cold weather, that pushed the neutral pressure level up into the attic. So the whole house was depressurized by the stack effect, and it would cause the fireplaces to smoke. They fixed that by air sealing the houses, and from about 8 ACH 50 down to 2 to 3 ACH 50, which is pretty tight. Not super tight, but pretty tight. They added 10 CFM a person of outdoor air ventilation to the air handler because they figured when they had tightened these houses up that much, the indoor wintertime humidity was going to be too high and they get condensation someplace in the envelope. That worked. Because it worked, they said, oh, by the way, we got some other problems. We got cracking gypsum board. We got cracks in the foundation. We got musty odors in the basement. Well, they fixed the gypsum cracking with floating gypsum corners and advanced framing techniques. And they went from a 2x4 wall to a 2x6 wall on 2-foot center. So better thermally, better insulation. They fixed the foundation by adding layered drainage systems to the outside of the foundations, and they put an inch of expanded polystyrene foam on the inside of the concrete walls before they put up fiberglass insulation over top of it, and that kept the aspergillus and penicillium from growing in the fiberglass. Now, for me, there are a few important points here. One is that the costs were all recouped by them going from a warranty program that was 9 two-person crews in a van doing warranty work full-time to 2. So they made something like a 5 to 10 reduction in their warranty cost. This is a builder who puts up 500 or 600 houses a year in the Chicago area. That's a partnership. I'm thinking of the builder as a practitioner, and they've been trained now to keep that work going. The warranty costs were down. They also improved the windows, and that was paid for by savings on the air conditioning equipment and distribution systems being reduced. These same principles were carried over to the Building America program, which in my experience is one of the most successful federal programs that have an impact on how buildings are designed and constructed in the United States, in particular residential buildings. So that's a big change. It's the kind of change that I don't have the personality to make happen, but I admire it when it does. The next one is
Terry,
I'm out of time.
we're
Stood.
putting against the next session.
Yeah, no problem, Richard. Thank you.
I want to go to your summary slide, or actually a question that someone put in is, what do you think? What's the most important thing you have learned in your building science career that you can pass along in closing?
Fire up your curiosity. But it's if you're curious, then you're listening to people. If you're curious, then you're trying to understand what's going on, and the better you can understand it, the more effective you can be at preventing or solving the problem. How is that?
Wonderful. Terry, unless you have do you have a closing slide or anything? To
I do actually have a closing slide I would like to put up, which is, see, we didn't get to the beautiful aspergillus or the zinc whiskers. Wait a minute, that's not the right one. Hang on. I do have it. Where is it? Oh, what do I do with it? Well, in that case, I'd just like to say that I make an announcement that the EPA search on the web for the EPA science webinars. They have Rich Corsi coming up later this week, I believe, to review the IOM EPA workshop on indoor PM, which I think is really important, indoor PM, thanks to the Dolly work done at LBI, and that'll help me a lot. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you so much, Terry, and we'll have to, for what questions we have, we'll try to get them addressed. Carrie, do you have anything additional we need to move forward? Nope.
Do I need to stop sharing? Is that how that works?
We'll take care of that.
Okay.
All right. So thank you for attending the plenaries, and y'all can move on to the speaker readies and for the next session. Thank you. Thanks, Terry.
Thanks, everyone. For folks exiting the plenary, please make sure that you exit this WebEx session using the red X at the bottom of your WebEx window. But stay here if you are a participant or attendee for the Healthy Buildings Roundtable IAQ and controls. So we'll be setting up for that now as quickly as possible and then get started. So please, thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Tammy.